Thank you, Beth. That's a lot of big words to have to say, so I appreciate you doing such a good job. I do not have the slides on this device. If you guys can make sure I have that, that would be great, because my eyes will not see that. Okay, other than that, I guess I will just look at this until such time as they do it. Okay, well, thank you very much. I want to thank DAPS for inviting me to do this talk. As you can see from the title, I have a unique position as both a neuropsychologist, which I'll talk about a little bit, and as a care partner to a person with Parkinson's disease. And I want to thank him as well. It's my lovely husband, John. Yes. Without him, I wouldn't know near as much as I do know about care partnering. Any luck on getting the slide on here? I can see myself if that helps. Okay, well, let's go ahead and start. I wanted to just start with a definition because we hear both caregiver and care partner a lot. Some of you may be old hands at this, so I may not need to explain it as much to you as I do to some groups that I speak to. But there is a difference, and we use the word caregiver for a really long time, so if I lapse into that, I apologize. Care partner is actually the preferred term now. But a caregiver is really a person who is providing care to someone who needs help, and it's more or less a one-way street. So the helper is helping the helpee, and there's not a lot of reciprocal help or value added to that relationship. In contrast to that, a care partner is a person that probably most of us are, and that is a person who helps someone who needs some help with, for whatever reason. But as care partners, we also get things back from them, right? We get love. We get assistance. I will talk a little bit more about that, about what John does for me, because it is not insubstantial and allows me to do a lot of the things that I do. So that's really the difference. So again, as I said, I sort of grew up in my career using the word caregiver. So if I use that word, I apologize in advance. But I want to make it clear that I am definitely a care partner at this point. Okay. So one of the things I want to do today is to be really real with you guys. I'm going to tell you the good, the bad, and the ugly in terms of being a care partner. One of the things that I think is really important is for all of us as care partners to acknowledge that what we do is hard, okay? Sometimes I find with my patients especially that care partners don't feel comfortable sometimes talking about how hard the job is. Partly because they feel like it's complaining or whiny, or their lot in life has been easier than the person that they're taking care of, and they don't feel like that's appropriate for them to complain. But the truth is that care partnering is a really hard thing to do. Okay, so we're going to start with that premise. If your care partnering journey is different from that, then I'm glad for you. But most of us experience a fair amount of burden over time. And so we're going to talk about some of that. On the screen, if you can read this, are some statistics about care partnering. About 90,000 people a year in this country are diagnosed with Parkinson's, and we have about 1 million folks who have already been diagnosed. Of the people that take care of them or help them, the vast majority are female. The vast majority are spouses. The majority are folks over the age of 60. And that makes sense, given that Parkinson's typically starts after the age of 60 with people, okay? Most of the rest of that 30% are paid caregivers, okay? So in some cases, people have both, but the vast majority are folks who are doing this without compensation at all, okay? And the burden of that is pretty real. Sometimes it is quite heavy. Sometimes it's lighter. It depends a lot on the stage of disease that the person that has Parkinson's has, and also on the particular circumstances that any given family might have. So in order to reduce caregiver burden, we have to pay attention to a lot of different areas. It's not just about learning how to cope better, although that's useful, but also we want to do things for ourselves as care partners so that we are taking care of our physical health, our mental health, our spiritual health, our financial health, all the different ways, okay? And different areas will be the focus at different times for people. But in general, it really pays to make sure that you're kind of keeping tabs on all these areas and how that's going for you, because it may be that something shifts and you need to kind of shift your focus to taking care of that area a little bit more. Next slide. Thank you. So now I just want to talk to you about my care partnering journey, and it started as a neuropsychologist. So I was a fairly young neuropsychologist when I started. I got my bachelor's degree at UTA, went to UT Southwestern, got my PhD in clinical psychology, and then did a couple of years postdoc in neuropsych. And along that path, particularly in my postdoctoral fellowship, I was introduced to Parkinson's disease. And I did assessments of those folks. A lot of the Parkinson's patients at that time were being evaluated for pallidotomy. We can talk about that later if you like, but it's a surgical intervention that was available well before DBS. And I also saw some folks for just evaluation of cognition and also worked with some families. So that was my introduction to Parkinson's disease. Along the 27 years since I left training, I have developed expertise in other areas, as you heard during the introduction. So I also got very familiar and somewhat expert in working with folks with traumatic brain injury. In the last 7 years or so, really have shifted to more functional neurological disorders. But I have continued to see people with Parkinson's and other neurodegenerative disorders along the way. So I feel like I have about 29 years worth of experience in working with folks that have this disorder. My next step as a care partner, the first step as a care partner, the next step is in understanding what Parkinson's was about, was when I took care of my dad. And so my dad, at age 68, was diagnosed with mild cognitive impairment, but very quickly after that, this says 3 years, that's true, but I was talking with the neurologist well before that. We determined that he had Lewy body dementia. Is there anybody here who knows what that is? Okay, couple hands. The probably somewhat incorrect but good way to think about it is that Lewy body disease is kind of a cross between Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. So there are Parkinsonian symptoms like tremor and balance problems and some of the sleep issues and some of the other non-motor difficulties associated with Parkinson's. But the primary issue is memory and cognition decline. So in that way, it's a lot like Alzheimer's disease. So that's what my dad had. My mom was taking care of him, and after a health scare that they had, they decided that they needed to move closer to one of their kids. My sister lived in northern Wisconsin in a small town. My parents much preferred small towns to Dallas, so they went up there, and they were there for several years. And during that time when they were in Wisconsin, my dad really needed to be put into a memory care facility because it became too much for my mom to take care of him. So that's what they did. Unfortunately, only a couple of years after Dad was put into a facility, my mom got cancer and passed away in a fairly short amount of time. And so then it was left to my sister and myself to figure out how we were going to take care of Dad. My sister's job had begun to require a lot of travel for her, so within a couple of months of my mom passing, we decided to move Dad down to Dallas so that I could help become his primary caregiver. He was still in a facility, I want to make that clear. I wasn't taking care of him day by day, but I was still the primary family member who was taking care of him. And he lived in care facilities, and his memory problems progressed. Eventually, he was not well, he called me by my mother's name for quite a while, and then he kind of forgot who I was, which was a very sad day for me. Any of you who have dealt with folks who have neurodegenerative disorders in this way understand that kind of pain. But he lived fairly happily and well in a memory care facility until he passed in 2017. So taking care of my dad really taught me some important things. So keep in mind, as a neuropsychologist, I sort of knew a lot of the things that care partners needed to know. I knew a fair amount about Parkinson's. I knew a fair amount about neurodegenerative disorders in general, including Lewy body. But living it is a really different experience from knowing about it. And so these are some of the things that I learned from experience as well as from books. So the first thing was that good financial planning is essential. And so I encourage you, if that's an area that needs some attention in your life, please pay close attention to that. My parents actually did a fantastic job of doing that long before Dad got sick. So that was very helpful to my sister and I, but my sister, who has an MBA, also took over some of the financial stuff and made some improvements in some of the things that they had decided once Mom had passed away. Another thing that I learned is that I needed to be willing to ask for help. And like a lot of people, I kind of thought, yeah, I got this. It's okay. I don't really need any help. And I was really wrong. So the first thing I realized that I needed was social support. And so my sister and I were on the phone a fair amount because she had some experience in taking care of Dad. Now I had the responsibility, and she was a really good source of social support for me. But beyond that, I learned that I needed to speak up and ask for help from the folks who were taking care of him day by day in the facility. And it can be tricky to figure out how to do that in a way that's not insulting or not angry, even if you are angry, things like that. So I did learn how to do that, but the most important take home is that I learned that I needed to ask for help from those folks because they actually did know what they were doing, and they were taking care of my dad 24/7, whereas I was not. So that was a really important part. I also had a long history of being a support group leader at that point, mostly for traumatic brain injury. And so I became aware that support groups for care partners of people that had neurodegenerative disorders were also really important. And when I say neurodegenerative, I'm including Parkinson's because it's all neurological conditions that get worse over time. That's what that means. I also learned in a very, in a real important way that being a care partner is a very difficult job. So you might think, well, yours wasn't that hard because other people were taking care of your dad, and that's fair, but it was still difficult. And for those who are doing it 24/7, I think it is not impossible, but darn near. It is a very, very difficult job, perhaps the most difficult job there is. And I've had little kids. Most of you probably have as well. Being a care partner was harder than that for me. So that's one of the reasons why you will hear me say, ask for help, ask for help, ask for help, because that can make a big difference. I did mention a minute ago about the grief that I experienced as my dad got worse, that sense of loss. My dad was perhaps the smartest human that I've ever known, a very multi-talented gentleman and a really good person. And it was very difficult to watch him change over time. And so that comes with feelings of sadness, that comes with grief responses. I know there were days when I would drive home from work or drive home from the care facility and just tears would pour down my face, right? Because it's a sad thing. Fortunately, because I was a psychologist, I didn't judge that, and I was okay with having those feelings. That helped. If you are not okay with that or you think you need to be strong or whatever, throw that out the window because that's not true. You're actually stronger if you can experience your feelings and accept them as opposed to trying to keep them inside of you. I also learned, thank you. I also learned that there were frustrations and anxieties, that come with the territory of being a care partner, particularly since I wasn't there 24/7 to take care of my dad, because you never know what other people are doing and saying and that kind of thing, so I had to learn how to cope with that. But I want to also emphasize, which we're going to talk about a little bit more at the end, about some of the joys that I found in care partnering. So I stand by my comment that it is one of the hardest things to do, ever. But there is a lot of joy involved, too, if you know how to look for it. So we'll talk about that in a minute. Part of focusing or being able to have access to that joy is being able to focus on the little things and be able to appreciate the little things. And I don't say that in a trite way. I mean that very seriously, like being thankful for good weather, or being thankful when you get a smile out of your loved one, or being really glad that they slept well that night. Things like that is what I'm kind of getting at. Those make a big difference in terms of, as a care partner, being able to find joy in the process. Next. So in 2010, John and I were dating, and he began to have some tremor in his left hand. And of course, he was misdiagnosed because we were young, fairly young, in our 40s. And, most people in their 40s don't get Parkinson's, so the first thing that he was diagnosed with was essential tremor, which I do not blame the neurologist for, because statistically that's probably what it should have been. But it did not respond to medication. So after about 18 months, I'd kind of had it up to here. And I got him in front of a movement disorders neurologist at UT Southwestern. 5 minutes into that appointment, the neurologist said, "Mr. Mixon, you have Parkinson's disease." And that was a real mixed feelings day for me, I have to tell you, because remember, I know what Parkinson's looks like. I've dealt with folks in all different stages. So there was grief and loss about that, but at the same time, I felt like, well, finally, we have a diagnosis. Maybe we can get some kind of treatment that will make a difference. And so there was both positive and negative feelings associated with that. One thing I remember is that John was very much I'm going to fight it, I'm going to do great, and I was kind of like, oh my God, what is happening? What are we in for here? So there was a mismatch in the way that we coped with that early on. But over time, we've kind of come back to ourselves and to each other. In 2012, that's when he got the diagnosis. He was on medications for a long time. As you can see, he's had it for 14 years now. The Parkinson's meds worked really well at first, and then less well over time. And so earlier this year, John underwent deep brain stimulation surgery, which he will be happy to talk to anybody about if you have questions about that. That was a tough experience, but a really good one ultimately for us. It really has allowed him to do a lot of things that he was not able to do well before that. Next. So I want to start with some of the good stuff, okay? Since DBS surgery in particular, this is a picture of John playing pickleball, the top one. He also is playing poker with our neighbors. We live in a 55 and up community that has a lot of activities, and he has gotten really involved there. He had kind of stopped walking our dogs, which was sad for them, but he is back to doing that, and they're happy. He is doing other things. He volunteers. He has become well known in our neighborhood for his banana bread that he bakes on a regular basis and then gives to neighbors. We have it's called Helping Hands. It's an organization in our community where we provide just love, basically, to our neighbors if they've had surgery or going through a hard time or whatever. So John is part of that, and he has, probably best for me as a care partner, he has gotten back to kind of taking care of our house. So he's much better than I am at cleaning, and he does that pretty well. We do have a structure for him so that he can remember what to do when, but he is really good about doing that and just taking care of me in general, which allows me to go off to work and do all my stuff So I am very, very grateful that he is able to do more of that than he was this time last year. Next. So those were the good things. Now I'll talk about some of the stressful stuff, okay? So I talked about financial stressors earlier, and I think for many families, this is a really big deal. Having any kind of health problem is expensive. Parkinson's is no different from that. The medications are expensive. All of you probably are very familiar with that. You have to go see the doctor periodically. There are sometimes multiple doctors that you have to see for different parts of the experience. And so that is an issue. In our case, because John has young onset Parkinson's, he was still working full-time as a high school math teacher when he was diagnosed. But it didn't take, about 2 years, I think, before he had to stop that because of Parkinson's. He could no longer write on the board in a way that was helpful. He was having drooling sometimes, which was not good with 15-year-olds. And so there were things like that happened. So he then had to come home, and then we applied for disability and that sort of thing. But that is way less money, as all of you know. We went from a 2-income family to a 1.2 income family. And so that required us to really think carefully about what our life was going to look like, what we were going to be able to do, what we were going to be able to save for retirement, all that stuff, that you think about over the long haul. And so that has been a change for us. We have been very fortunate that we have not suffered significant financial difficulties in the sense that we haven't been fearful of not being able to afford food or housing. But it's still a stress, even if things are relatively okay in that area. Social stressors, I can't even say that very well, are also an issue. And some of you may be experiencing this as well. So both John and I are introverts, me probably more than he. But there are times when he gets very uncomfortable in groups of large people, like parties in our neighborhood, for example. And so we have kind of developed this agreement that we will go to the event if that's something we want to do. We will both go, but he can say, I'm ready to go half an hour or so later. He has to give it a little while for my benefit. And then we can go. Or there are times when he just doesn't want to go, and then I have to make the decision, do I want to go by myself or do I want to stay home? So for some folks, if one of you is an extrovert, particularly if you're the care partner that's an extrovert, that may be harder than it has been for us because I'm kind of a homebody myself. But it is something that you have to kind of think through and figure out how can you get some of your social needs met and still honor what is difficult for your care partner. Sleep disruption has been a big non-motor symptom for John. He's much better since DBS surgery, but before that, he probably never slept more than 2 or 3 hours at a time. So he would sleep for a bit, then he'd be up for 3 hours, then he would go back to sleep, and it was sort of that on and off thing all day long, which really gets in the way of doing a lot of things that you want to do in your life. And so that was very frustrating. I've been very, very happy that DBS has helped him with that somewhat. He still struggles with it, but now he's up to more like 5 or 6 hours of sleep continuously, which is way more reasonable, but still naps quite a bit. So part of his calculus in the day has to be when can he set aside some time for a nap, and that seems to work pretty well. Emotional stressors I've sort of alluded to already, but those are really an important area for care partners to pay attention to as well. John is one of those Parkinson's patients who has had depression from time to time, really 2 episodes probably in the 12 years that he's been diagnosed. In both cases, fortunately, I know folks in the community that I can send him to. There are some ethical issues with me sending him to my friends, but I still know psychologists in town that he can go see, and he has done that to his credit. And there's been one time when he was on medication for a while. I think that the most important thing about that is to catch it early. And so one of the things that I have depended on John to do is to tell me when he feels like things are not going well for him, when he feels more depressed, Then we kind of talk about it, and if it looks like we're kind of headed toward a depressive episode, then we jump on it. So we do not wait until the depression is sort of solidified and gotten worse. And I encourage you, if that's your story, to also be really alert to that, because it is far easier to treat depression successfully if it's not severe. And so catching it early is the name of the game. Another piece of being a care partner to John specifically, but a person with Parkinson's disease in general, is the additional burden that I and a lot of the care partners that I interact with now as well talk about, is having to kind of assume responsibility for a lot of the planning that takes place in your life, particularly if it's your spouse, but this is even true if it's your parent or a sibling, that kind of thing. So we do still talk about all big decisions that we make, for sure, sometimes a lot longer than John would prefer. But I'm a shrink, so what do you want to do? I have to talk. We do talk about that stuff, but the reality is that I'm the one that kind of sets up the organization. I'm the one that says, did you call the doctor today? I'm the one that, says we need to go to the grocery store. I'm the one that puts the list together, all of that kind of stuff. And none of those things by themselves are particularly burdensome, but when you add them all together, it's a lot of mental energy. And if you do that after you've worked a 50-hour a week, sometimes it feels burdensome, I'll be honest. But it is what it is. And so being able to make sure that I'm still functioning in that way, in a way that works for both of us, means that I have to really take good care of myself. So I want to talk about that as well. You guys probably have heard this. It's an old care partner group mantra that if you're not okay, your loved one will not be okay. And that is 100%. Okay? There is no getting around that. If the care partner goes down, the care receiver is going to suffer because of that, okay? And so it is vital that care partners take really good care of themselves. And so how do I do that? I'm just going to tell you my strategies. Maybe they will be helpful to you. I'm interested to know at the end if you guys have other strategies. That would be really helpful to me and to probably everybody else. So number one is I pay very close attention to my own physical health. So I see my doctors regularly, my primary care doctor, I have an endocrinologist, and I see those two people every 6 months or so, even if I'm fine. And usually I feel fine, but I still get those checkups. I see the dentist every 4 months. That's just a me thing. Other people probably are fine with it a couple times a year. But I am making sure that I am keeping track of my health and being as proactive as humanly possible to keep myself in good shape. I've made changes to my diet to be healthier, particularly in the last year or two. And that is finally paying off, which is great. It took like 6 months before anything moved at all, but that's a good thing. So I'm really encouraged by that. But even when I wasn't losing weight, I still felt better when I was eating better. And so I encourage you to, if you're feeling fatigued or feeling just blah as a caregiver, really pay attention to your diet because it does matter. I've also started exercising fairly regularly. I don't want to present myself as any kind of paragon of exercise or any kind of role model for anybody, but we do play pickleball. And I'm looking forward. We've been off while it was very, very hot, but now that the weather is starting to get a little bit cooler, we're looking forward to getting back to that in the next week or two. Walking the dogs, I do that as well, lifting some weights, things like that. So whatever it is that you like to do as an exercise, I highly encourage that you find time to do that on a regular basis. That is probably my biggest challenge, I will be honest, in terms of health. Is I get home, between 5 and 6, and I'm tired. I want to eat dinner and go to bed. But finding time to do that is really important. I also get massages once a month, and I understand that's a privilege, and not everybody can do that. But I find that is worth the money for me because it helps with muscle tension. It's really not for relaxation because it actually kind of hurts. But it is very useful to me in terms of just knowing that I'm doing that to take care of myself and kind of helping with some of the muscle tension that I get in my neck. What else do I do? On the emotional front, I do lead a caregiver, care partner support group in our neighborhood. I said that I had been doing that for a really long time, and I did. I stepped away from the brain injury folks and moved toward the caregiver folks a couple of years ago. And that has been as good for me as it has with anybody else in the group. So I am both a leader and a member of that group, and it has been very helpful to have that kind of emotional support. There's something to be said for going into a room where you can talk about what's hard and people nod their head. They know, right? You don't have to draw them a picture or over-explain it. So that I really encourage for you to find that as well. There are several foundations, Parkinson's Foundation, DAPS, Michael J. Fox Foundation, all of them have support group information on their websites. Some of them are virtual, some of them are in person. You do what's best for you. I also have started participating in a weekly meditation group, and that has been enormously useful to me in terms of finding ways to kind of calm my head, make my brain turn off a little bit, experience some peace for a few minutes. It's not that I'm not peaceful other times, but it varies depending on what's going on. But that 25 minutes that I spend with my meditation group once a week has been really, really helpful, so I highly recommend that as well. There are some meditation apps on YouTube, and there's one that you can get on your phone called Calm. There are multiple places where you can do that. You can start very slow, like I started with 3 minutes, and have kind of worked up to 25 minutes. So I think that that's a really useful thing to do. And if nothing else, it gives you 25 minutes all to yourself where you can just focus on your own breath and how you're doing in your body. I also spend a lot of time learning, and John can tell you this. It drives him nuts. I'm often on YouTube just learning stuff because I just like to learn things, reading books, various other ways that I really try to stimulate my own brain. I don't do that because I'm worried about losing my cognition, although, my dad had dementia, so you never know. But I very much find it rewarding and soul-feeding to do that. So if you're like that, then I really encourage you to find ways to learn on a fairly regular basis because it feels really good, even if you never use the information. I also really pay close attention to my own emotional status. So I will, on the way to work, a lot of times I'll say, how are you doing? Are you stressed out? Are you sad? Are you happy? What is going on? And just doing little check-ins with myself. This is part of my meditation practice as well, so that's become easier. But as a psychologist, I understand how important it is to just check in with yourself and ask yourself, how am I? And then if the answer is not good, then the next question is, okay, so what do I need to do to be better, right? There's nothing that's going to take away the stress of being a care partner, but you can certainly develop skills and find ways to cope better. So hopefully these ideas are useful to you as well. Social health is that other category that we talked about earlier, and this is how I kind of pay attention to this in myself. I am pretty good about calling up my kids, or they call me, and I talk to John's mom pretty regularly. All these people live away from me, and so we do a phone calling and video chatting and that sort of thing to just stay connected with people that I love the most. But also, I do the support group that I mentioned, which are my neighbors, and we have found that to be really, really helpful. John and I also try to make a point to spend time with us together. I mean, that's just a good thing to do if you're married. But there are things that we enjoy doing together, like playing pickleball, playing Scrabble. I'm proud to say that I can now beat him at least half the time. And that, if you knew us, you would know that was a big accomplishment. John is an excellent Scrabble player. So that's been fun. He's less enjoyed that than I have. But we do things together. We try to walk the dogs together. We hang out in our study and work on whatever we're working on our computers together, things like that. I mentioned our neighborhood group that sort of helps our neighbors, and I am part of that. My biggest job there is running that care partner support group, but also periodically I'll bake something or help out with an event or something like that helps our neighbors, and that really is very useful to me. Also, I get to meet some really cool people that live close to me. And then we try to participate in at least one social event a month. I mentioned that that's not always John's favorite thing to do, although I will be honest, sometimes he was the one that wants to go and I don't. But we do try to get out and do stuff with our neighbors or with our friends that don't live in our neighborhood, at least once a month. And so that's been really soul-feeding as well. Last week we went to a neighbor's house for a debate watching party and dinner. So you can kind of make anything a social event. We do better in small groups than we do in big groups just because of our personality styles. But it's still really good social interaction for us. And then the last thing I've done is in the last 3 months, I have joined a book club. I mentioned to you that I love to learn things, and part of that is reading. And so now I'm reading a lot more fiction, which is totally fine. But that's been fun too, because I've met a whole group of people, about 10 ladies in our neighborhood, that I did not know before. And now we talk about books that we've read and argue about whether or not they were good and all that good stuff. It's been really useful. So I encourage you to kind of identify what is it that you like to do and how can you infuse some social support or socialization in that activity as much as possible, because there usually are ways to do it. Okay, the last part that I want to talk about are just some of the common struggles of care partners. So some of these I've already mentioned that were my particular experiences. Some of them probably are yet to come. The first one, the first slide is really about if your diagnosis has been recent. So some of the things that care partners struggle with really quickly after the diagnosis is kind of dealing with the shock of it, kind of trying to figure out what does this mean, learning about the disease, what to expect. There's a lot of that happens. Finding good health providers is a real challenge for a lot of folks. If you live in Dallas, then you are blessed because we have a fair number of movement disorders physicians in this community. That is not true if you live in a small town typically, but I strongly encourage you to find, even if you have a regular neurologist in your community, to find a movement disorders neurologist that you can see at least once in a while, just to kind of keep track, because there are new therapies that come out all the time, and these are the docs that know the most about that. And I call them regular neurologists, general neurologists may not know about all of that. So it's good to have those people in your corner. Making decisions about treatment, for us is pretty straightforward now, but early on there were a lot of questions, right? Like what medicines do we take? Not we, him. What medicines to take, what are the side effects, keeping track of all of that. It can be, as Dr. DeLeon said, the first year or two can be kind of rough trying to balance everything out and figure out what good levels are. I will warn you that you will find your optimal medication, which is great, and then in 2 years, you're probably going to have to switch it again. So things change over time, and so you can't just make a decision and then that's the end of it. You really have to kind of be flexible with that and figure out what's going to help at what point in your disease or your loved one's disease. Finding support for all of the needs that we've just talked about, including non-motor things like sleep, mood, things like that. Finding providers for that is really important. And like I said before, kind of keeping track of it and making sure that you don't let it get too bad before you address it. That's going to be a lot easier. A lot of the folks that I've dealt with and in therapy are families that are trying to figure out, like, what do we tell people? Some folks that get diagnosed with Parkinson's don't want to tell anybody, and that needs to be honored. However, they may need to identify people that it's safe to talk to about, because to not talk about it at all is not a great thing. That's going to be difficult. And so, balancing out the care partner's need to talk and the person that has Parkinson's need to talk, that's going to require negotiating, right? Because care partners need to talk too. And so it may work that you can find a support group with people that your loved one does not actually know, and they're okay with you talking to them about it. It's the people that they do know that they care about. What to tell employers is another thing. John and I had this conversation for probably 2 years before he finally decided to retire. And that's tough, depending on the nature of your job. You may or may not be able to identify some accommodations that will work well for you, particularly if you need accommodations for things like fatigue and you need breaks, that kind of stuff. But I encourage you to really think through those things, talk with people who've been there and done that, talk with your providers, get as much help as you can in trying to make those determinations. One of the things I will tell you, and I've said this already, but trying to go it alone is a big mistake. Normally, I'm not so definitive about things. I think people need to do what's good for them, but I feel pretty confident in saying that going it alone is a mistake for virtually everybody, if not everybody. So please find folks who can be of help to you, either socially, financially, medically, all the things, okay? If you do try to do it by yourself, then what you can expect is that all those negative aspects of being a care partner are going to get bigger, okay? So you have to be aware of that, and asking for help can make all the difference. Next slide. Okay, I thought it was on mine, but it's not. Not paying attention to your own emotional health is also a mistake, I think, in most cases. I told you that I do little check-ins with myself. I strongly encourage that you do that. Not doing that can result in problems like depression and anxiety and sleep problems for you, as well as other kinds of feelings. And all of the feelings that are on this slide are completely normal. Ambivalence, which means having mixed feelings about something, being angry, whether that's at yourself. I hear that a lot from care partners, actually, feeling guilt and anger toward themselves because they got mad and yelled at their person that they're taking care of, for example. But those are really important. Sometimes it's okay to talk with people about being angry with the person who has Parkinson's too, because they're still people and they're still going to annoy you at times. So that's going to happen. Being angry with God, if you're a religious person, is also a pretty common thing. Why'd you let this happen to us? That kind of thing. Embarrassment, grief, disgust, especially if you're having to do things that are just gross. Sometimes in the very last stages of this disorder, people need help with toileting or bathing or things, and not all care partners are super comfortable with that. So those feelings are all really normal, and having an outlet to talk about them, or a journaling habit or something like that, can be really, really helpful at taking some of the steam out of that. I think that trying to maintain equilibrium is one of those things that you have to do for the rest of your life. So like I said before, sometimes being a care partner is fairly easy. Sometimes it's very difficult. There's a lot of space in between those two things. And it's going to be like this. Some days or weeks are going to be really hard. Some days or weeks are going to be a lot easier. So being able to kind of maintain your equilibrium from an emotional standpoint, and also from a cognitive standpoint, like how well you're processing information and remembering things and all that good stuff, is really important. Over time, the person that you're taking care of is going to change. Their needs are going to change, which means you have to change. And if you don't, then you create more stress for yourself. So keeping that kind of idea of balance has been very helpful for me, that it's not we found the answer and now we're just going to stay there. It's always this, right? You're always tweaking it a little bit and finding out what you need right now. That will be helpful. Trying to maintain a social life can be a real challenge for care partners, particularly if the person with Parkinson's is not able or does not want to do a lot of the social interaction. So it can be lonely. You can feel like you're left out at times if people just stop asking you. A silly example is that my son and daughter-in-law are big hikers, and there is no way that they're going to invite us to go hiking with them, okay? Partly because they think we're old. That's fair. But partly because we can't do it, right? I mean, I can't either, but that's a different question. John can't do that. And so they're not going to invite us to that, and having to be okay with that, that we have to find other ways to be with them and enjoy them, which we have done. But, that's not something that's caused a lot of distress, but sometimes there are things that cause distress, like not being invited to Christmas or not being invited to go out to dinner to celebrate something, stuff like that. That can all be difficult. And so being able to talk about that, being able to recognize that that's tough, and finding different alternative ways to be with your loved ones is really important. Not just your loved ones, but also your friends. Sometimes it's a challenge to find things that you can do with your loved one, and I encourage you to think long and hard about what those might be, because spending time together, typically it's a spouse, as we said before, but spending time with your brother or sister or parent, those are all really precious amounts of time, because none of us get unlimited time. So finding things that you can do together is really important, even if it's just sitting and enjoying a cup of coffee together. It doesn't have to be anything major, but just spending time that's quality for both of you. Losing colleagues at work can also be very stressful, particularly for the young onset folks who are working at the time that they start on this Parkinson's journey, typically. And you have to kind of figure out if you're going to retire so that you can be a care partner full-time. How are you going to replace that daily interaction that you have with other people? And it's probably going to look really different. You may be able to keep some of those relationships from your work friends, but chances are most of those will go away, as anybody who has ever left a job knows. And you have to be able to fill in with other people. Again, this is where groups like DAPS is really important, because you can find community here, and that can be one of the ways that you begin to substitute for social support and social interaction. Next. I've already talked about this a fair amount, so I'm going to skip it, but just to say, pay very close attention to your health. Your health is really important, and it becomes more and more important the more that you are doing for your loved one. Same thing with financial issues. Get a good financial advisor, make a plan, follow your plan, and it will reduce the amount of stress that you are having to experience on a daily basis, because there's not much worse than not having enough money to do the things that you really need to do. That is very stressful. So getting as much help with that as you can, highly recommend. Next. Okay, I promised you I was going to talk about joys. This is really short, but powerful, okay? There are joys that are associated with care partnering. So first, it is really satisfying. As a care partner, I can tell you, I hope that those of you who are care partners also agree with me, it's very satisfying to be able to provide care for somebody that you love dearly, to make sure that their life is better because of what you're doing. That feels really good. And sometimes we forget about it because we get used to doing it, but to refocus on that and go, oh yeah, that does feel good, that's, I think, really important. You also, as a care partner, are very likely to experience personal growth. You are going to learn to be a bit more patient. You are going to learn to be a bit more creative in your problem solving, perhaps. You may develop other sorts of skills that you didn't have before, and that's all a good thing, right? It is all beneficial both to you as a person and also to the person that you're taking care of. I said patience, persistence, and presence. Those are, it sounds like a sermon, but for me, that's what I have gotten joy-wise. I have learned to be more patient. I am not a patient person by nature, I will tell you that. But I'm better than I used to be. I'm also very persistent, and I always have been persistent, but now I'm persistent in a different way. So before I was really persistent in terms of work and goals and that kind of stuff, and now I'm more persistent in little daily things. And so that has been a change for me, which I think has been really positive. And then the last one, presence, which just has to do with being still and being joyful and paying attention to, the still small voice in your head. If you're a religious person, to your relationship with God, that kind of thing, and being present with other people as well. You're probably going to, over time, become more appreciative of the little things. I hope so, because I'm telling you that's where most of the joy comes in. And so really training yourself to pay attention to those things is a good thing. And then that includes an appreciation for living in the present, because none of us gets guaranteed any time, right? We have today, that's it. So being fully aware of that and embracing that, I think, is a key to having some joy. Are we late? We need to stop? Okay, I'm gonna stop right there. If there are any questions, please feel free to ask them, and if we run out of time on that, then you can come and ask me individually. Any questions about care partnering? Some of you are probably more expert than I am. Yes, sir. Yeah. I actually feel that. I do. Fortunately for me, John is pretty good at making dinner. But you're right. I mean, that is a challenge. One of the things that I would suggest is, if you know what to do and you're not doing it, maybe talk to like a nutritionist and get some ideas for things that will address whatever the barriers are. So if, like in my case, the barrier is I'm tired when I get home. I don't want to cook. Oh. Gotcha. I am sorry about that. Nutritionists, like everybody else, are all different. So it might be useful to talk to a different one, but even if you don't want to do that, I think there's a lot of information online that you can get. The main thing is to focus on what are the actual barriers. Am I too tired? Do I just have that I don't care attitude? Do I just really like dessert? I don't know what the barriers are, but when you address the barriers, you get better, right? So I don't think that people lack motivation so much as they don't want to do things. And so when we can figure out what we don't want to do, and you don't need an analyst for that, then you get a lot further along down the road. I think that, a lot of people don't know that there's a lot of prepared foods that are decent for you that you can get. It costs more, but there are certainly ways to do that that are less, require a lot less chopping and a lot less effort. But I hear you, that's a challenge. There's no question. I will stay here for a few minutes if anybody wants to ask me anything, and I really appreciate your attention. You guys were awesome.